Hey guys, imagine for a moment a reality where your kids need your blessing just to speak during supper, where your spouse stands holding a heavy platter until you take your seat, and where handing someone the sugar bowl incorrectly could, well, damage your standing forever. Welcome to the Victorian home, a relentless pageant of etiquette acted out every single day under your own roof. And before we dive in, just a quick note to those of you who watch these videos and then quietly disappear without hitting subscribe. That's alright, if you want to remain as unnoticed as a Victorian housemaid in the corridor, but if you'd rather be recognised, go ahead, subscribe. It feels good to be acknowledged once in a while. And by the way, what hour is it in your part of the world? The Victorians would definitely have opinions about being awake at this hour. You walk through the entrance of a proper Victorian residence, and before you've even removed your overcoat, you're already inside a mechanism. Not a family, in today's understanding. No, this is an apparatus, a social apparatus, complete with cogs, levers, and an extremely rigid operating guide. Sitting at the peak of this structure was the head of the household, the gentleman whose name was written on the property papers and supposedly on every significant choice. You rarely encountered him before 9 o'clock. He was occupied reading the daily newspaper in a seat nobody else would dream of claiming. His words held the force of command, though truthfully his spouse frequently managed the domestic operations with considerably more exactness. Following her came the lady of the house, the coordinator, the domestic administrator, the individual accountable for preserving the family's social position without ever appearing to labour in the contemporary understanding. She commanded her own chain of authority, not merely her offspring, but her household staff, merchants, and the network of familial duties that Victorian culture made intentionally intricate. She understood precisely how many utensils belonged on the supper table, which acquaintance was presently in disfavour, and how to organise a week's worth of meals so the household could seem both properly nourished and tastefully moderate. Then you had the firstborn son, successor to whatever wealth, honours or standing the household could assemble. His education was an investment in the family's reputation, not simply his personal prospects. He was meant to be intelligent but not conceited, courteous but not weak, and ready to assume the duties of his father, preferably without destroying the estate by wagering it all at the gentleman's club. Following him were the daughters, a classification more complicated than you'd assume. A firstborn daughter was virtually an assistant household administrator, particularly in substantial families. She was educated in dialogue, embroidery, and the delicate skill of hosting visitors without seeming either anxious or detached. Her younger sisters were trainees in this identical discipline, though their primary objective was more straightforward: prevent scandal and ideally wed successfully enough to spare the family from supporting them. Beneath the daughters stood the younger sons, frequently destined for military service, religious orders, or the overseas territories. Society anticipated they wouldn't inherit significant property or riches, so they were directed toward professions that provided a decent salary and prevented them from causing trouble. And then you had everybody else, the individuals who made the whole framework function. The residing staff, the head servant, the kitchen manager, the chamber attendants, the manservant, the lower kitchen workers, the children's instructor, and occasionally a caretaker or nursery attendant for the youngsters. Each staff member had a specified domain of responsibility, which entryways they accessed, which household members they could speak to without mediation, and which responsibilities were permanently assigned to them regardless of how monotonous or draining. Below them, in position and frequently living beyond the residence, were the temporary workers. These were the laundry workers, groundskeepers, dressmakers, and messenger boys who maintained the household, provisioned without ever being completely integrated into it. They were vital but unseen in the family's social displays. Now, here's the aspect contemporary minds occasionally find difficult. Even The building design mirrored this structure. The primary stairway was reserved for household members and distinguished visitors. Staff utilised the rear stairs, confined and slanted, running straight from the kitchen to the upper levels. The arrangement of the residence was a tangible representation of position, which meant you could determine an individual's place in the structure merely by observing which entrance they employed or which stairway they ascended. Language obeyed the identical principles. You didn't simply call someone by their given name unless you held equal or superior rank. Staff might reference young Master Henry or young Miss Eleanor well into their mature years, while household members could address personnel with a family name exclusively. Parker, deliver the refreshments. And this wasn't merely about courtesy. It was about continuance. Social structure in Victorian Britain was upheld with hidden boundaries. Violate one, converse too casually, use the incorrect entrance, occupy the incorrect seat, and you might discover yourself terminated, reduced in rank or discussed until your standing was irreversibly damaged. Here's where the mockery composes itself. Even the household canine frequently held greater status than the most junior staff member. A pedigreed hunting dog might receive remnants from the master's dish. The lowest kitchen worker. She could only consume food after every other person in the residence was nourished, and frequently in the chill. This structure wasn't merely a diagram in an etiquette manual, it was experienced moment by moment. From the manner correspondence was labelled to the way fuel was transported to each heating source, you'd sense it in the heaviness of the entrance fixtures. Metal alloy for the parlour, simple timber for the scullery. You'd detect it in footfalls. The deliberate, resonating stride of the master in the corridor versus the rapid, hushed movement of an attendant avoiding notice. And you, yes, you. If you existed in this residence, you'd understand precisely where you fit in the sequence. Not because anyone instructed you outright, but because everything communicated it to you. The expressions, the arrangements, the areas you were permitted to access without requesting entry. Even the atmosphere seemed denser when you entered a chamber where you weren't entirely welcome. The Victorian household was a theatrical production, and the domestic structure was the platform. Every part had dialogue, wardrobe, and positioning, and if you misremembered yours, well, the spectators observed, and they seldom clapped. If the upstairs household was the performance space, all gleaming expressions, thoroughly practiced courtesy and deliberately positioned seating, then the staff accommodations were actuality. And in actuality, it's not candle glow and courteous recognition, it's banging cookware, the sound of a heated pressing iron on moist cloth, and a kitchen manager cursing quietly because the seafood vendor delivered behind schedule once more. Down in this space, the morning begins hours before anyone above has even shifted position. Heating sources must be ignited, and not merely in the parlour. In every chamber where a household member might enter and anticipate warmth. Floor coverings must be cleaned, fuel containers refilled, sanitary vessels carefully cleared, and if you're picturing the odour, yes, it's precisely what you're thinking, only more unpleasant. Before morning meal, you, at this instant, are the manservant. Your uniform is immaculate, but your undergarment's already adhering to your spine. You've dedicated the previous half hour buffing the metal railings on the primary stairway, the one you're theoretically not meant to utilise unless you're accompanying a visitor's garment, or transporting a serving platform. Your palms throb, but in several hours you'll be positioned like a monument beside the eating chamber entrance, acting as though you were destined to support a silver tray. Here's the reality about being in employment. Your existence must be sensed but not observed. You are the oxygen that keeps the residence operating. Without you, the window coverings would hang crooked, the precious metal would oxidise, and the cooked meat would reach the table cold. But you don't receive recognition. You receive additional labour. Food preparation is a tactical endeavour. The kitchen manager operates the cooking area like a military commander, shouting instructions in a mixture of English and whatever additional tongues she's acquired from former employers. The lowest kitchen attendant scrubs vessels large enough to immerse a small child in. The head servant confirms every drinking glass is perfectly transparent and every beverage transferred into the appropriate container, not because the master will detect it, but because the visitors could. And standing is the exchange medium of the residence, and most importantly, there are regulations. Regulations so embedded you don't consider them until you contemplate violating one, such as never starting dialogue with a household member unless they address you initially. It's not merely protocol, it's continuation. A staff member who disregards their position might be released with no recommendation, and in employment, no recommendation means no position. No position means no residence, and no residence in Victorian Britain means, well, you wouldn't survive the cold season. Above, they might announce, "We're hosting a modest supper gathering this evening." Down in this space, that converts to buff every utensil, freshen the finest table coverings, arrange a table so flawless that if the monarch herself appeared, she'd discover nothing to amend. Furnishings gets repositioned carefully, seats angled toward the optimal illumination, leg rests positioned exactly you don't occupy them, naturally. You merely prepare them for the individuals who will, and the heating sources, the heating sources. Each one must be encouraged into existence just before the household wakes, so the chambers seem mysteriously warm, as if the fuel simply awakened out of devotion to the master. Its portion of the deception. Above, ease seems automatic. Down in this space, ease is a constant struggle with residue and carbon. In the staff dining area, there's no silverware diagram or positioning arrangement, but there is a structure. The head servant occupies the primary position, the kitchen manager near the front, then experienced attendants, inexperienced attendants, and ultimately the lowest kitchen attendant who, if she's fortunate, might obtain the final position by the cooking area entrance, where it's frigid, but at minimum she can depart promptly for another cycle of cleaning. You as manservant exist between two realities. You're noticeable enough to be perceived, unnoticeable enough to be disregarded. You'll discover the household confidences long before the acquaintances do. Who consumes excessive alcohol, who disputes after supper, who inserts correspondence into the postal system without the head servant's awareness. And you'll never mention it, not even to other staff beyond the residence. Dedication is your protection. But here's the genuine truth upstairs. They might discuss how their staff are virtually household members. Down in this space you understand that household members wouldn't endure a 7-day period if they had to transport fuel or clean footwear before morning meal, and yet, for all the manual labour, there's an unusual satisfaction in making the unachievable appear simple. When the master enters his parlour at exactly 9 o'clock and discovers the heating source blazing, the floor covering spotless and his newspaper positioned beside his beverage, he'll presume the reality just operates that manner. You'll understand differently. You'll have created it thus. Because the reality is, the Victorian household's elegance and composure depended completely on the efforts of individuals who weren't intended to participate in it. And as you position yourself in the dim areas of the corridor, waiting to access the following entrance, you comprehend this is your role in the performance, not the lead, not even the backup. You are the crew member who guarantees the production never ceases. And the spectators, they'll never discover your identity. Now that I consider it, this is precisely how most of you regard this channel. You appreciate the labour but never utter a syllable. Continue? Subscribe? At minimum, let me recognise you observed the exertion. If you believe the Victorians only staged a production for their acquaintances, you'd be mistaken. The theatrical display didn't conclude at the entrance. It merely transformed platforms within their personal residences. Victorian households existed as if someone, somewhere, was perpetually observing. And in a manner, they were. Staff observed, offspring observed, visitors could materialise without advance notice, and most concerning, rumours could depart the residence more rapidly than the fuel powder left your footwear. From morning meal to evening rest, decorum was the regulation of the territory. That meant no boisterous amusement, no spreading across a seat, no resting on the fireplace ledge as though you were supporting it upright. Stance was paramount. Remain vertical, palms properly positioned, not moving restlessly, not tapping your digits. And if you were questioning, yes, this applied even when you were fatigued, famished, or solitary. You, at this instant, are the firstborn daughter of the residence. Your mother has just reminded you once more to conduct yourself a phrase that somehow signifies walk, recline, position, and even respire, as if you're being captured for a painting. It's insufficient to be virtuous. You must appear virtuous at the table. The regulations increased. You didn't converse with your oral cavity occupied, naturally, but you also didn't discuss anything crude. And crude encompassed considerable territory, ailment, physical processes, governmental disputes, and most particularly, currency. You could examine the value of produce at the marketplace in a casual, lyrical kind of manner. Oh, the berries are costly this season, but not the particulars of how much anything valued. Genuine figures were for the master's office, never for the eating chamber. If you expressed amusement too vigorously, someone might conclude you were delighting yourself, and we cannot permit that. Amusement, if it occurred at all, was refined and momentary, more of an agreeable murmur than an authentic explosion of happiness, the variety of expression that communicated, yes, I'm sophisticated enough to comprehend cleverness, but controlled enough not to alarm the silverware. And then you had the skill of dialogue itself. The Victorians regarded dialogue like a sporting match, cautiously exchanged back and forth, never striking too forcefully, never permitting the sphere to descend. You questioned after someone's well-being without ever investigating into genuine conditions. You asked about their garden without providing unrequested guidance. You praised their residence without sounding like you were mentally reorganizing the furnishings. Even when there were no visitors, the household rehearsed these ceremonies with one another. The offspring learned promptly that they were component of the domestic's display. It wasn't merely about proper conduct. It was about appearing like you belonged to a household of standing, whether that standing was genuine or hopeful. And it wasn't merely stance and dialogue. Garments participated. If you were a gentleman, you didn't move about in your undershirt sleeves. Even within doors, that was labourer's clothing. You displayed a vest because a partially clothed gentleman was regarded a moral danger for women. Even a relaxed morning garment was selected with attention. Robes were acceptable for the sleeping chamber, but if you proceeded into the corridor, you confirmed the material was appropriate, the fastenings secured, the house shoes presentable. The peculiar aspect is that even the most private instances had a stratum of ceremony. A father might encounter his daughter in the corridor and provide a gesture rather than an embrace. A mother might acknowledge her son's keyboard performance without genuinely meeting his gaze for extended duration. Sentiments were controlled like delicate porcelain, presented sparingly, managed with attention and preserved away before anyone became too relaxed. And you recognized profoundly that even here, in your personal parlour, the spectators could transform at any instant. An acquaintance could visit without advance notice. The entrance signal might sound. And within moments, the entire household would transition from their authentic condition into guest mode. Tones quieted, palms were brushed over garments. Hair was adjusted, and expressions manifested like gas illumination sparking to existence. The outcome? A manner of existing that obscured the boundary between private and public. Even when you were unwinding, you were practicing. Every movement, every utterance, every look was component of the unspoken arrangement that maintained the household standing undamaged. The Victorians didn't merely exist in their residences, they acted in them. And if that sounds tiring, well, it was. But it was also continuation. In a culture where rumours could destroy you more rapidly than financial obligations, presentations weren't merely pride, they were exchange medium. So you maintain your spine vertical, your tone composed, your amusement controlled. Because in Victorian Britain, the instant you disregarded yourself, the instant you permitted evidence that you were mortal, was the instant someone might begin questioning if your household was entirely as proper as they appeared. If you believe morning meal is merely about nourishment, you've obviously never been to Victorian Britain. Here, morning meal was a declaration. It didn't merely communicate, "We're commencing the morning." It proclaimed precisely who you were, how much you could manage financially, and how much you cared about permitting other individuals realize it. Let's commence at the peak of the social scale. The upper tier. You this morning are the master or lady of a substantial rural residence. Morning meal isn't something you assemble hastily in the cooking area. It's something that materializes like a theatrical scene transformation. In the eating chamber, the table is already prepared with pressed cloth, buffed precious metal and porcelain that has likely outlasted more household conflicts than you'd prefer to acknowledge. Multiple selections are anticipated. There might be eggs heated, immersed or mixed, presented in precious metal egg holders that reflect the illumination just properly. There's chilled meat from yesterday's roast arranged on serving dishes. There's kedgeree, an Anglo-Indian grain, and preserved seafood preparation, because nothing communicates colonial influence like commencing your morning with spice seasonings before the sun has completely ascended. And, naturally, bread. Not merely bread. Bread in a precious metal bread holder so it can cool gracefully instead of perspiring itself saturated on a dish. There are preserves in carved glass containers, dairy, spread in coordinating enclosed domes. If you're questioning about the morning publication, yes, it reaches, but not before it's been pressed. Not for cleanliness, as some prefer to claim, but to eliminate wrinkles so the sheets can be rotated in dignified quietness. Staff materialize and disappear with a variety of arranged invisibility, substituting vacant tea vessels, providing coffee, maintaining the heating source at exactly the proper degree of crackling. Nobody requests for anything because optimally nothing is ever absent. Now, let's descend the social scale to the middle tier. Here, the objective is not merely to consume morning meal, but to make it appear as though you're nearly upper tier. You have silverware, or at minimum, something coated to substitute for it. Your bread holder might be tin rather than precious metal, and your porcelain might originate from a retail establishment rather than a London supplier. But the organisation on the table is calculated. A proper middle-tier morning meal might contain eggs, perhaps a portion of cured pork or preserved pork if the finances permit, and bread with dairy spread and preserves. Beverage is presented, occasionally coffee. The publication reaches, perhaps still creased from the printing without the luxury of a pressing iron, and is circulated around the table. Here, protocol still matters, but it's more about ambition than flawlessness. You don't recline at the table in your undershirt sleeves. You display a morning coat or proper house garment. Offspring are anticipated to recline appropriately and express pleas and gratitude before extending for anything. And while you might not have a head servant, there's a substantial probability your spouse or firstborn daughter is quietly controlling the display, confirming that everything appears slightly more refined than the finances genuinely permit. For the middle tier, morning meal isn't merely about consuming, it's about rehearsing. Every morning is a practice session for the instances when visitors might be available or when a commerce contact might appear unexpectedly. The table transforms into a modest platform where you execute your household's optimal version of sophistication each, even if it signifies presenting preserved pork only on rest days, so the aroma persists sufficiently for the acquaintances to detect. And then, at the foundation of the scale, the labouring tier. Here, morning meal is eliminated of ritual. There's bread, perhaps covered with rendered fat, or a small amount of dairy spread if you possess it. Beverage is almost widespread, it's heated, it's inexpensive, and it stimulates you sufficiently to commence a morning that will almost definitely be dedicated on your lower extremities. Preserved pork is a luxury, not a fundamental. Grain mixture might appear in colder periods, consumed straight from the vessel. If you're in a rush, protocol here is functional. Don't squander nourishment. Don't be tardy. Don't obstruct anyone else who's attempting to depart the entrance to labour. There's no precious metal bread holder, no coordinating vessels, no cautiously creased cloth squares. The emphasis isn't display, it's energy. If you're labouring tier in Victorian Britain, morning meal is power source. You consume sufficient to survive through hours of physical work without collapsing. And while you might comment about how elite individuals press their publications, the reality is you exist in a separate reality completely. They're presenting a theatrical production, you're enduring the morning. Yet across all tiers, one element is persistent. Morning meal establishes the atmosphere. For the prosperous, it's a gentle, unhurried occasion, a period to examine, to dialogue, to quietly exhibit standing. For the middle tier, it's an activity in social advancement, a daily performance of refining one's social execution. For the labouring tier, it's an essential refuelling pause before the strain. And if you were to retreat and observe all three tables, the precious metal-covered arrangement, the humble reproduction and the exposed timber surface, you'd witness the complete Victorian tier mechanism in miniature. Each table communicates a narrative. Each narrative commences the identical manner, with a container of something heated to consume and a collection of unspoken principles about how to consume it. So whether your morning commences with kejeri beneath a lighting fixture, bread at a cooking area table, or bread by a public assistance heating source in Victorian Britain, the manner you consumed morning meal communicated as much about you as what you genuinely consumed. If you're visualising Victorian youth as a whirl of timber playthings, literature and carefree afternoons, you may want to recline or preferably position yourself. Appropriate stance was promoted from the sleeping cradle. In Victorian Britain, offspring weren't perceived as progressing individuals with distinctive personalities. They were incomplete adults, masses of ethical material to be moulded into flawless, compliant and socially acceptable human creatures. From the instant you could ambulate without collapsing, you were being educated. Educated to recline without moving restlessly. Educated to converse without expressing abruptly. Educated, most importantly, to be quiet unless addressed. In numerous households, being virtuous didn't signify compassion or imagination. It signified invisibility. You presently are a decade-old youngster in a proper middle-tier residence. You completed your morning meal quietly and now you're positioning in the parlour because your mother hasn't provided you authorization to recline. Your palms are interlocked before you, your spine is vertical, your gaze is lowered because staring at the heating source excessively might be regarded impolite, and heaven prevent you should be discovered reclining. The principles are infinite. You must never disturb an adult. You must never amend an adult, even if they are incorrect about something as transparent as the morning of the 7-day cycle. If a visitor confuses you for your younger relations, you express approval and gesture because amending them would be disrespectful. And if you absolutely must expel air forcefully, you rotate away, conceal your oral cavity with a cloth square and express regret as if you've just displaced the household precious metal. Boys grew up with a single purpose: to become honourable men with honourable professions. That could mean law, ministry, the armed forces, or for those born into wealth, overseeing the family property. Recreation was permitted, but only when it masqueraded as learning. Miniature soldiers weren't mere playthings. They were training for tactics and self-control. Devouring adventure tales was acceptable, provided the protagonists demonstrated courage, integrity and obligation. Girls, by contrast, grew up following a completely different program. Their final professional destination was matrimony. Traditional education might give them literacy, arithmetic and basic knowledge, but within the home, the genuine instruction focused on posture, embroidery, piano and the delicate skill of seeming both delightful and humble. You were supposed to perform just adequately enough to amuse in the sitting room, but not so brilliantly that you appeared to be grandstanding. You mastered pouring tea with elegance, dressing independently, and moving through a space without colliding with furniture, because poise was value, and awkwardness could ruin you completely. For boys and girls alike, the consequences for breaking the rules came quickly. Corporal punishment was widespread. A wooden stick across the fingers, a strike, or standing isolated in a corner. But the crueler consequence was disgrace. A let-down expression from a mother or father could wound more deeply than any rod. The Victorians understood the force of public embarrassment, and they used it without mercy. Free time. What small amount existed was strictly controlled. Kids might be permitted to play outdoors, but never in the roadway. Yard activities were promoted, but racing too frantically could be viewed as vulgar. Giggling was acceptable as long as it wasn't too boisterous, and anything dirty, like making mud cakes or roughhousing, was absolutely forbidden. Schooling, particularly for the middle and wealthy classes, was less about discovery and more about conforming to society's template. Boys might go to residential academies where the mornings started with freezing baths and concluded with Latin exercises. Girls might be dispatched to refinement schools where instruction in French was viewed just as critical as instruction in flower composition. And here's the catch. Even within the home, kids were seldom alone with their mother and father. The children's quarters was a separate realm, controlled by a caretaker or tutor who imposed the family's regulations with strict efficiency. Parents might drop by for 60 minutes in the evening, like gracious rulers examining their charges before withdrawing to the grown-up sphere. Downstairs, for labouring-class households, the situation was distinct but not inherently simpler. Here, kids were required to add to the family's sustenance as soon as they were capable. Boys might deliver messages, maintain fires, or learn a craft. Girls might assist with washing, watch over younger brothers and sisters, or perform piecework. At home, quietness was still prized, but in this instance it was less about sophistication and more about productivity. Excessive chatter meant reduced work completed. Yet throughout all social levels, one doctrine dominated: compliance. A child who challenged an instruction was regarded as a potential problem. Self-directed thinking was a risky indulgence, one that could humiliate the family or threaten its carefully preserved standing. And so you adapt. You adapt to remaining motionless when your muscles hurt. You adapt to grinning when you're uninterested. You adapt to staying silent when you possess the solution and the grown-up in the space does not. You become skilled in the wordless vocabulary of Victorian youth, a vocabulary where a look, a stance, or how you position your hands can communicate. I am proper, I am compliant, I fit in. The outcome? By the moment you enter adulthood, the act is instinctive. You've been practicing for years, you emerge into society already understanding the expectations, and already understanding what occurs if you violate them. Because in Victorian England, producing flawless children wasn't simply about affection, it was about standing. And standing, like delicate porcelain, was treated with caution, buffed regularly, and never permitted to reveal a flaw. Truthfully, some of you are already excellent Victorians. You sit there silently, never subscribing, just watching. Shatter the pattern, hit the button. I guarantee no one will banish you to your room without dinner. You are a proper wife in Victorian England, or more accurately, you are required to appear like one every conscious moment of the day. From the exterior, your existence might resemble a prolonged, unhurried drift, from morning beverage to afternoon visits, interrupted only by the periodic appointment for a new dress. But the reality is, you direct an entire estate, and you're required to accomplish it in such a manner that nobody ever witnesses you genuinely labouring. Your actual position, supervision without traces. You manage the personnel, the chef, the cleaning staff, the instructor, ensuring the domestic apparatus functions seamlessly. but you never transport fuel or wash a surface yourself. You determine the week's dishes, but it's the chef who makes them materialize. You select the blooms for the parlor, but a servant is the one placing them in the container. You coordinate every element and then withdraw so that your residence seems to function smoothly, as if ease and structure simply occur. You compose correspondence, countless correspondence. Letter writing is a wife's instrument as much as the sweeper is a servant's. Requests for new fabric go to the textile merchant. Solicitations to meals are sent on clean paper. Gratitude messages are dispatched for presents, even if the present under consideration is a grotesque container you intend to hide in the storage space. And naturally, there is the holy practice of requesting merchandise. Whether it's tea from the provisions shop, wax lights from the candle supplier, or the newest style from a London seamstress, you are the family's buying division. Yet the decorum here is complicated. The merchant may be in commerce, but you must never appear excessively friendly. Exchanges are courteous, ceremonious, and preferably quick. Then there's your personal presentation, an undertaking in itself. In a single day, you might switch garments 3, even 4 occasions. Morning attire is for breakfast and minor domestic tasks. Afternoon attire is for welcoming callers or conducting visits. Dinner attire is for the evening course, more ornate, with superior materials and deeper shades. And mercy help the woman who is discovered wearing the incorrect thing at the incorrect moment. And let's be transparent, while these wardrobe standards are rigid, they're also a communication system. A deliberately selected ensemble indicates to other women of your social set that you grasp the requirements, that you are mindful, that you fit in. The incorrect dress, or even worse, the incorrect accessories, can suggest carelessness or even monetary difficulty. In Victorian culture, those suggestions spread rapidly. Beyond wardrobe, there are the implicit regulations, the kind no manners guide ventures to record. But everyone understands, for example, a lady never consumes food in the road. Never. You may be famished between engagements, but to be observed eating a pastry on a public street corner is crude. Nourishment is to be consumed in seclusion or in the appropriate environment, at a tea setting, in a meal room, or during an organised outdoor meal, and even then with an attitude of mild self-control. And then there's the skill of presence. You must be visible enough in your social sphere to stay significant. Going to the proper functions, conducting visits on the proper individuals, but never so constantly present that you seem eager. Your schedule is a meticulously balanced routine. Insufficient appearances and people overlook you. Excessive appearances and they believe you have nothing more important to occupy yourself. Kids, if you possess them, contribute another dimension to your responsibilities. You are required to be the ethical guide, the refined model, the judge of their conduct. Yet here, too, you seldom execute the daily work yourself. The instructor or caretaker manages most of the direct instruction, but you authorise the lessons, adjust the periodic stance, and organise the periodic tea where your kids can exhibit their cultivation to callers. Your residence is a reflection of yourself, and so it must perpetually be prepared to wow. That means an endless rotation of fixes, substitutions and buffing, all arranged by you, frequently weeks ahead of time, so there is never a noticeable gap. A broken teacup, a grimy shelf, or a slight odour of moisture could be interpreted as a personal shortcoming. And let's not overlook the psychological work, though Victorians wouldn't have employed that phrase. You resolve disputes between staff. You create polite discussion with the boring acquaintance who can't cease discussing her relative in Cheltenham. You discover gracious justifications when your husband brings someone troublesome to dinner. You accomplish all of this without ever appearing rattled, because your calm is part of the domestic illusion. In summary, you are both the soul and the brain of the residence, a position that requires constant focus while acting to require none whatsoever. You are noticeable in results, invisible in struggle, and that is the contradiction of the proper wife. To seem peaceful while discreetly maintaining an entire household universe together. And when the day is finished, when the flames are extinguished and the staff withdraw, you finally breathe out. The next day it all starts again. The correspondence, the costumes, the silent supervision, and the pattern persists, as sleek and shined as the silverware on the breakfast setting. You are the Victorian husband, leader of the family, income earner, ethical protector, and the household's public representation. Or at minimum, that's how it appears on the exterior. In reality, your position is a meticulously written performance. Culture requires you to move through the world with calm command, supply for your household, establish an ethical standard, and most importantly, preserve the impression that your residence is a stronghold of steadiness and standing. Nobody wants to witness you struggle, and if you are having difficulties, you conceal it behind shut entrances. Your workdays are a juggling act between employment and presence. The income-earning aspect is clear. Whether you are a lawyer, a financier, a manufacturing proprietor, or a well-positioned gentleman in commerce, your main obligation is to produce the revenue that powers the domestic apparatus. But merely making money isn't sufficient. You also have to be observed in the correct locations, greeting the correct individuals, and ensuring that your household's reputation stays associated with decency. That's where the cultural requirements start. Nights at the Gentleman's Society are not merely relaxation, they're relationship building masked as fellowship. In hazy timber-covered spaces, you trade business chances over fortified wine, debate governance by the fireplace, and sometimes participate in table games with a man whose greeting might someday guarantee your son's prospects. Business meals follow much the identical structure. Extended nights in exclusive meal spaces, consuming dishes that require hours to present, each one accompanied with its own alcohol. The nourishment is significant, but the discussion is paramount. A perfectly timed story about your previous journey to the mainland can create possibilities. A badly selected statement can shut them just as rapidly. Then there's the house of worship, not discretionary. Going to gatherings isn't simply a question of belief, it's a public obligation. Your attendance in the household bench every Sunday morning indicates that you are a man of principles, self-control and structure. Missing worship without an ironclad justification could prompt questions. And questions are the adversary of standing. And discussing adversaries, there is one regulation you never violate. A gentleman must never address a woman he doesn't recognise unless officially presented. It doesn't matter if she releases her hand coverings in the road or appears completely confused. Convention requires that you locate a shared connection to create the presentation before a single word is traded. Anything else risks being understood as boldness, or even worse, impropriety. This regulation is so embedded that you could observe the identical woman daily on your morning stroll, and never address her unless someone else states, "Mr. X, may I introduce Mrs. Y?" Your clothing is also part of the position. In the morning, a dark outfit for commerce. In the evening, formal dark attire or even formal white attire for ceremonious events. Head coverings are not discretionary. A gentleman's head covering is as much a component of him as his family name. The standard and design of your clothing subtly announce your location in the cultural ranking. But make no error, being the leader of the household does not mean you are exempt from decorum. There are regulations for you as well. At the dining surface, you slice the protein and present the ladies first. You never discuss negatively of a caller, no matter how tedious they are. You rise when a lady arrives in the space. You accompany your wife to dinner, even if you've had a fierce disagreement that morning. The performance must continue, and while your wife supervises the family from behind the curtain, you are its public protector. Any offence to your household, a doubtful whisper, a distant reception from a previous connection, must be handled carefully, tactfully, and without creating the perception that you've even recognised. Your composed, controlled reactions are part of what makes the family seem unbreakable, in seclusion. You may desire more hours at the residence, but the unspoken reality is that a husband's unavailability is part of his standing. To be excessively accessible, excessively inactive is to prompt murmurs. The man of the residence is intended to be out in the society, creating agreements, establishing relationships, and coming back only to appreciate the well-structured household refuge his wife preserves. And so daily, you enter into the position again. You are the income earner, yes, but also the envoy, the relationship builder, the representative, the ethical guide. You maintain the mechanisms operating not only with currency and coins, but with presentations, movements, and the invisible wealth of standing. Because in Victorian England, a husband didn't simply represent himself, he represented the complete household. And one public error could destroy years of careful development. Dinner in Victorian England was never simply dinner. It was a show, a meticulously planned piece of drama in which the organiser was both manager and principal performer. The callers were secondary performers, and the nourishment was the stage decoration. If you were organising, your solicitations alone transmitted a signal. A ceremonious dinner wasn't something you assembled because the pantry appeared stocked. This was cultural wealth. Every name on the caller list was selected with thought. Household supporters, commerce associates, individuals whose power could be beneficial afterward. And the irregular cultural climber who was being evaluated for harmony with the group. Once they showed up, the show started in earnest. The placement plan was paramount. And no, you didn't simply place individuals down wherever there was an unoccupied seat. A placement configuration was a miniature chart of the cultural hierarchy itself. The most significant callers, aristocratic nobility, prosperous supporters, or maybe the peculiar relative with a shocking amount of wealth, were positioned nearest to the organizer and hostess. From there, the status descended outward like waves in a body of water. You, as the caller, were required to acknowledge the privilege or offence of your positioning without anyone clarifying it. Being positioned too far down the surface could feel like being dispatched to cultural exile. The surface itself was a demonstration in regulations, napkins creased precisely so, silverware arranged in an exact sequence from the exterior in, so you wouldn't humiliate yourself by utilising the seafood utensil on the main dish. Every dish, every drinking vessel, every flame holder had its location, and pity helped the staff member who positioned something a portion off. The nourishment arrived in dishes, frequently more than you could tally. Broth, seafood, main dish, roasted meat, sweet course, final course, dairy products all in sequence, all with a proper utensil, a proper accompaniment, and a proper observation or absence thereof. You might believe this was about savouring the course. It wasn't. It was about demonstrating that you understood the system. And then there was the regulation. You never flavoured your nourishment at the surface. No additional salt, no additional pepper. To do so was to suggest the chef, who might be an anonymous staff member you'd never encountered, had disappointed in their skill. It was a wordless but crushing offence. Even if the seafood tasted like steamed fabric, you grinned, agreed, and consumed it with the manner of someone who had been presented ambrosia from the divine. Discussion was just as significant as the selection. You addressed the individual on your right during one dish, the individual on your left during the next. A refined game of verbal musical chairs. Subjects needed to stay neutral. Books, journeys, atmospheric conditions, places you'd mutually explored, finances were off limits, governmental matters dicey, and intimate revelations an utter disaster. As the organiser, your responsibility was maintaining dialogue momentum without seeming to direct it. As the visitor, your responsibility was proving captivating without overpowering and pleasant without appearing dull. This equilibrium could establish or destroy your community position. Even consumption speed counted. Too rapid, and you appeared gluttonous. Too sluggish, and you delayed the advancement of dishes. The sweet spot was completing each serving just seconds before the attendant removed it. A minor marvel of coordination, considering you were simultaneously handling courteous dialogue, intricate implements, and cuisine that was frequently tepid by the moment it arrived. For the privileged ranks, these suppers were a stage for quiet rivalry. Whose dinnerware sparkled most impressively? Whose joint was sliced with the greatest finesse? Whose invitation roster featured the most notable personalities? For the merchant classes, elaborate suppers were an opportunity to mirror the aristocracy, typically with somewhat less expensive silverware, reduced dishes, and slightly heightened nervousness about whether the joint would prove sufficient. And for the labouring class, the spectacle of supper appeared remarkably different. No arranged seating, no ceremonial presentations, no servants moving soundlessly between dishes. Supper was utilitarian. Loaves, brewed leaves, maybe some protein or tubers. When the days had been prosperous, manners here centred on managing, not creating impressions. Yet still, numerous households embraced minor ceremonies. The patriarch dividing the protein, youngsters waiting their turn, reflections of the ceremony observed above in the magnificent residences. The night would conclude, just as it started, with presentations. The lady of the house, standing from her seat, indicated the women to retreat to the parlour, abandoning the gentlemen to their tobacco and spirits. The show had been executed to the final moment, and everyone understood their function. You departed the table satisfied. But more significantly, you departed understanding whether you had ascended or silently descended the invisible community hierarchy. Since in Victorian England, supper wasn't concerned with your consumption, it revolved around your dining companions and whether you executed your function flawlessly. Supper is finished. The final portion of dessert has been carefully cleared, the remaining particles swept away and the flames adjusted. Now arrives the most foreseeable segment of the night, the great after-supper movement. If you're a gentleman, you already understand your destination. The tobacco chamber. If you're a lady, you'll be proceeding to the parlour. And no, there's zero possibility of blending, not unless you desire to provoke suspicion or spark gossip. It's not that anyone openly acknowledges why this custom exists, but the logic is transparent enough. The genders must possess their own distinct relaxation areas, because, heaven help us, the women discover how tedious the men truly are. For the gentlemen, your route is decorated with the assurance of tobacco, spirits, and an atmosphere dense enough to smoke without flames. The dialogue here is a blend of commerce, governmental matters, and the sporadic tale from academy years, all recounted with the assurance of men who presume no one will ever challenge them. Pool is a frequent selection, with bets placed in coins or rounds of beverages. If you're not participating, you're resting against the fireplace, one arm positioned on it in that practiced stance of masculine comfort. The tobacco chamber is equally about position as unwinding. The selection of tobacco, the tailoring of your vest, the manner you pay attention, sufficient to seem interested, but not excessively as to appear overly keen. Meanwhile, you as a lady in the parlour are welcomed by the gentler sound of porcelain vessels and the whisper of fabric gowns. Here the dialogue shifts to community updates, books, maybe the newest controversy in a distant location, which renders it acceptable to mention. Musical performance is a regular after-supper pursuit. If there's a keyboard in the residence, someone will be encouraged to perform, and if you're the spouse or offspring of the organiser, it could be you. Visitors will acknowledge graciously, even if your execution is more passionate than proficient needlework also appears. The ladies retrieve their projects with dexterous digits, stitching in designs that have been retained over decades of training. If the gentleman's tobacco chamber is about demonstrating expertise and authority, the parlour is about demonstrating cultivation and composure. You might believe the two groups are universes distant. And in some respects, they are. But each area is executing the same fundamental purpose, demonstrating visitors, acquaintances and relatives that everyone comprehends their station. Gentlemen strengthen their functions as choice makers and guardians, even if most of the night's dialogue centres around the calibre of the recent delivery of fortified wine. Women strengthen their functions as maintainers of elegance and friendliness, even if half the chamber is silently questioning whether the needlework frame will ever be completed. The division also has a functional component. Without the gentlemen, the parlour is liberated from tobacco haze. Without the women, the tobacco chamber is liberated from anyone questioning a fourth tumbler of spirits. Ultimately, in some residences, the two groups might reconvene. The gentlemen adequately ventilated reconnect with the ladies for a closing cup of brewed leaves or coffee. The dialogue becomes lighter, more cautious, maybe a session of indoor amusements like pantomime or 20 inquiries. These are crafted to entertain, without threatening any genuine humiliation. Youngsters, if they are sufficiently mature to remain awake, might be permitted to participate, an occasion for them to demonstrate their deportment and appeal under guardian observation. Though, the notion of gender-divided relaxation after supper is somewhat of an illusion. In more compact residences, everyone remains in the identical area simply because there isn't elsewhere to relocate. Still, customs trickle downward. Gentlemen might congregate around the flame to discuss labour, while women maintain their digits occupied with stitching or repairing. It's less concerned with tobacco and more concerned with functionality. But the division of pursuits can still be sensed. The complete configuration, the after-supper separation, the hushed ceremonies, the distinct chambers exists to preserve the community structure, even in relaxation. It's not simply about ease. It's about transmitting the signal that the residence is honourable, that everyone grasps their function, and that there will be no uncomfortable blending that might obscure the boundaries. Naturally, if you happen to be a visitor who favours the alternate group, a woman who appreciates a game of pool, or a gentleman who would prefer to experience musical performance, you'll need to conceal that inclination. Acknowledging it would be like admitting that you appreciate consuming in the thoroughfare, and as we've determined, that would be coarse. So you remain in your designated area, performing your designated pursuits, communicating in your designated manner. The night diminishes not with explosions, but with a hushed, content recognition that you have maintained the implicit agreement of Victorian respectability for another day. Romantic pursuit in Victorian England wasn't something you encountered randomly. It was constructed, arranged with the exactness of a strategic operation. Only instead of war zones and artillery, the instruments were guardians, parlours, and an elaborate system of looks and movements. If you were youthful, unwed, and of appropriate background, your amorous existence developed almost exclusively within the household's domain. You didn't encounter someone in the manner contemporary people envision. You were presented, and not simply to anyone. Presentations were meticulously selected occasions created to guarantee you were in the company of people your guardians could accept and potentially profit from. Your every exchange occurred under the observant gaze of a guardian, typically your mother, an elder sibling, or a trusted female relation. Their responsibility wasn't simply to maintain you respectable, it was to guarantee you didn't cultivate any hazardous notions about pursuing your emotions. Instead of the household's accounts, these guardians were experts of gentle disruption. Right when the dialogue began to feel intimate, they'd enter with an irrelevant remark. The atmospheric conditions have been rather moist, haven't they? As if trivial conversation could wash away any trace of affection. Most of these romantic pursuit meetings occurred in the household parlour, a chamber created to appear inviting but in actuality operated like a display area. Here, everything was visible. The furnishings, the household's preferences, the calibre of the beverage service, and, naturally, you. The parlour was also a location for wordless exchange. A lady's fabric square, for instance, wasn't simply for respiratory clearance. If she released it intentionally and a gentleman retrieved it, it could indicate attraction. The positioning of a cooling device was another manner of signal. Unfolded and moving meant she was receptive to conversation. Folded and directed downward meant she was finished with the exchange. In the appropriate setting, these indicators could express far more than language. But, and here's the crucial part, you had to understand the system. Misinterpreting it could be catastrophic. Release your fabric square before the incorrect gentleman, and you might invest the following decade evading him at every community gathering in the locality. Your mother, meanwhile, was the invisible designer of your amorous possibilities. She determined which visitors to welcome, which gatherings to visit, and which strolls in the gardens might fortuitously overlap with suitable company. In her perspective, she was not constructing a union. She was directing your opportunities. Mothers held an almost mystical capacity to detect the magnitude of a gentleman's earnings. From the tailoring of his jacket, they could identify a future relative's defects at 20 steps, yet somehow disregarded them completely. If the property was substantial enough, your father's function in this sequence was more straightforward but equally significant. He was the ultimate approval marker. Once the gentleman under consideration had progressed through the maternal screening, the father would escort him privately for a hushed discussion. This was not concerning affection, this was concerning conditions. Could he provide for you? Was his standing secure? Did his household designation carry influence? If the responses were acceptable, the romantic pursuit could advance. If not, your father might softly, or not so softly, direct the young gentleman toward the exit. Even in society, romantic pursuit was still a household matter. Strolls in the gardens, excursions to the playhouse, afternoon beverages, all were performed in clusters with at least one respectable adult attending. The concept was to provide you just sufficient interaction to assess a potential match's deportment, dialogue and presentation, but not sufficient seclusion to formulate your own choices. For labouring class households, romantic pursuit was less ceremonial, though still affected by the same concepts of decency. Meetings might occur at congregation gatherings, celebrations, or while out purchasing, but even then the attendance of acquaintances or relatives was typical. Standing mattered universally. A young woman observed strolling unaccompanied with a gentleman risked rumour, regardless of her rank. Every phase in the sequence, the presentation, the courteous dialogue, the exchanged looks, was component of a gradual movement toward ultimate betrothal. It could require months or even years before a proposition was presented. And at every phase, the household's impact was persistent. Affection in this environment was not concerning impulsiveness. It was concerning approach. Every expression, every utterance, every invitation was evaluated and contemplated. A single violation of deportment could reverse months of cautious manoeuvring. The Victorian household viewed romantic pursuit less as an individual expedition and more as a commercial transaction with sentimental additional advantages. And while affection matches did occur, they were frequently the fortunate coincidences of a properly constructed romantic pursuit rather than its fundamental objective. So if you were a young Victorian traversing this realm, you mastered to execute your function. You mastered to express pleasure without committing excessively, to observe without disclosing excessively, and to transport your fabric square just in preparation. Because in Victorian England, romantic pursuit wasn't simply concerned with locating the correct individual, it revolved around guaranteeing everyone else believed you had. And just like that, your destiny could be determined over a vessel of brewed leaves and a moving cooling device which is, candidly, not that dissimilar from your destiny. Here, if you never commit, you'll float back into anonymity and will both act we never encountered, if that's what you desire. Victorian households didn't clash the manner you might envision. There were no struck barriers, no yelled charges across the supper surface, no theatrical pronouncements that someone was never communicating to you again, at least not before observers. Oh, they clashed, they differed, they smouldered, but they executed it in the most respectable manner feasible. Concealed under strata of courteous language and flawlessly composed tones that, if you attended closely enough, were blade keen. If you resided in a Victorian residence, you discovered early that visible disputes were hazardous. Public displays of emotion were looked down upon. They made the family appear uncivilized, which was essentially a character flaw, and so conflicts were managed with icy silences and courteous words that meant precisely the opposite of what they seemed to say. If someone at the breakfast table remarked, "Your comments last night were lively," you could be sure it wasn't praise. If they noted, "We should discuss this later," what they really meant was, "We will never mention this again, but I will harbour resentment quietly until one of us passes." Often the preferred weapon was silence itself. In a Victorian household, silence wasn't tranquil, it was electric. Entire relationships could decay in the space between two people who occupied the same roof but hadn't spoken more than 3 words in a week. And then there was the written note. The Victorians adored their correspondence, even when the recipient was in the very same house. If tensions rose, it wasn't unusual for one family member to send another a handwritten message rather than address them face to face. It was a method of managing the delivery, preventing a confrontation, and, let's face it, ensuring you could select every word with calculated precision. Picture receiving an envelope after breakfast addressed to you in careful penmanship. You open it and discover something like, "My dear Henry, I must object to your behaviour at supper last night. Your comments regarding my selection of companions were both harsh and unfair. I shall naturally attempt to forget them, but I trust you will steer clear of such subjects in future." Translated into everyday language, you humiliated me in front of company, and I'm livid. But I will only express it in this profoundly formal manner that allows me to appear generous while you marinate in remorse. In more affluent homes, where several drawing rooms existed, disputes sometimes manifested as territorial games. You might choose to spend the afternoon in the green drawing room because you knew your sister favoured the blue one. She, naturally, would spend the day in the green one too, just to establish the point that she wasn't going to be displaced. Even meals turned into combat zones, not in the food itself. God forbid anyone raise their voice at dinner, but in who sat where and whether particular dishes were conveniently placed beyond reach. If you had irritated your mother that morning, you might find yourself exiled to the far end of the table, 3 seats away from any dialogue, staring at a tepid pudding and questioning if you'd ever be pardoned. With children, parental disagreements were seldom shown openly. Parents might hold a perfectly cordial conversation over tea only for the mother to later direct the governess on a completely different course of action than the father had recommended. The outcome? The child followed the mother's strategy. The father pretended not to see, and the household continued as if harmony had been upheld. Even marriages, often pictured today as intensely romantic or bitterly fractured, were in the Victorian world often characterised by this kind of subdued conflict. A husband might answer his wife's objection about his late nights at the club with, "My dear, I shall try to be more prompt," then proceed to alter nothing. The wife might strike back by redecorating the study without asking him. Neither would label it retaliation, but both would grasp perfectly well what was occurring. And still, public arguments were inconceivable. If guests were around, the facade of unity was preserved at any cost. A couple might have been engaged in a cold war for months, but in company, they'd smile, hand each other the butter, and concur on the qualities of a Shakespeare reading as if nothing were wrong. There was a kind of skill in this, the capacity to despise each other tastefully, to maintain the act so seamlessly that outsiders never detected the tensions. In a way, it was another expression of Victorian etiquette. Understanding that even your most bitter disputes must be wrapped in civility before they were permitted into view. For the working classes, the guidelines were a bit more flexible, but not by much. Respectability still counted, and even humble households prevented full-blown fights in front of the neighbours. Disputes might occur in whispers, behind locked doors, or in mumbled exchanges while walking home from church. So if you were part of a Victorian family, you learned to interpret the signals. The extended pause before a response, the careful selection of words that sounded agreeable but wounded deeply, the sudden fascination with the embroidery basket whenever you entered the room. These were your alarm bells, and if things became truly intolerable, well, there was always the ultimate Victorian remedy. One of you could conveniently go visiting for a few weeks. Absence might not resolve the problem, but it did allow tensions to ease, and more importantly, kept the household's facade of propriety intact. Because in the end, it wasn't about settling the conflict. It was about ensuring no one else ever knew it was there. In Victorian England, religion wasn't just something you embraced, it was something you demonstrated, and that demonstration was daily visible, and if you were part of a respectable family, absolutely mandatory. Sunday wasn't the only time devotion was on display. It was simply the most public time. Every morning before you even considered breakfast, there might be family prayers. The household would assemble. Yes, even the servants, if the master demanded to listen to a reading from Scripture. Heads lowered, voices hushed, and no squirming permitted. A Victorian child who dared yawn during the Lord's Prayer could expect a glance from a parent that suggested the soul was already halfway to damnation. Evening prayers, too, were a staple in many homes. Picture the lamps turned low, the family assembled in the drawing room or kitchen, the pages of the Bible worn from handling. You'd kneel on the carpet or sit rigidly in a chair, hands clasped as a passage was read, and perhaps a brief moral lesson delivered, often one that served as a pointed observation on your conduct that day. You might hear the parable of the prodigal son right after your older brother came home late, or a reading about idle hands the morning after you had been discovered avoiding tasks. The church itself was more than a place of devotion, and it was a social platform. You didn't just attend to serve God, you attended to be observed attending. Missing a service without a legitimate excuse, illness, travel, or death in the family could start tongues wagging faster than a scandalous letter, and legitimate excuse was a matter of rigid interpretation. Feeling a bit weary, not acceptable. Weather slightly troublesome, not acceptable. If you had the energy to walk to the market or sit up at home, you had the energy to occupy your pew and be numbered among the righteous. Church attendance was an act of social record-keeping. It reminded the community you were still respectable, still following the moral code. Your pew, often rented or bought by the family, was a silent statement of your standing. The superior your pew, closer to the front, clear view of the pulpit, the more it communicated about your position in the world. For children, Sunday school wasn't a choice. It was where you memorized Bible verses by heart, sang hymns in your finest voice, and internalized moral instruction designed for your future role in society. Boys were taught to be honest and hard-working, girls to be humble and compliant. All were taught to fear both God and the social repercussions of wrongdoing. The sermons themselves could be lengthy and, to a modern listener, perhaps a touch monotonous. But in the Victorian context, they were integrated into the rhythm of life. The preacher was as much a moral authority as he was a religious one, his words forming not just your spiritual beliefs, but your comprehension of what was acceptable conduct in the eyes of the community. And it wasn't just about Sundays. Religion wove itself through the week in ways large and small. Mealtime prayers, scripture quotations inserted into conversation, hymns sung in the parlour on winter evenings. All of it strengthened the sense that morality was always under scrutiny. In some households, this moral instruction extended beyond the Bible. Popular conduct manuals full of guidelines on proper behaviour were regarded almost like secondary scripture. You could quote the Psalms, yes, but you might also be able to recite passages on the proper way to enter a room or the merits of never speaking poorly of anyone, unless, of course, it was done delicately. Enough to pass as worry. Servants, too, were required to maintain the family's religious image, even if they didn't belong to the same denomination. Their attendance at family prayers or church could be demanded. After all, a master or mistress couldn't have the neighbours believing their household was like careless in its moral obligations. Skipping church without a proper excuse was unimaginable, not just for the disgrace it brought, but for the questions it prompted. Was there sickness in the family, difficulty, or worse, a drifting away from the moral path? Gossip was a ravenous creature. An absence from the pews was like tossing at fresh meat. For many, faith was authentic, deeply felt and sincere. The rituals brought solace, the readings offered direction, and the prayers gave structure to the day. But even for the devout, There was an understanding that religion in Victorian England was also a public commodity, a way to proclaim your respectability, your discipline, and your belonging. And so you went. You rose on frigid mornings and put on your finest clothes. You sat through sermons with a rigid back and an engaged expression, no matter how heavy your eyelids became. You nodded along with hymns you'd sung 100 times, and when you departed, you knew the performance had been registered by every eye that counted. Because in the Victorian family, religion wasn't just about your relationship with God. It was about your relationship with everyone else, and the unstated rule that to be respectable, you must be witnessed to be righteous. In Victorian England, death didn't conclude with the funeral. It initiated an entire system of etiquette, clothing and public display that could persist for years, all constructed to signal to the world that you were grieving appropriately. If you were a widow, that meant 2 full years in heavy black, known as full mourning. Not just a black dress, but black gloves, black veils, black bonnets, black parasols. Even the trim had to be black, ideally in dull, non-reflective fabrics, because heaven forbid your grief catch the light. For those first 12 months, you were basically expected to exist as a visual memorial to your late husband. Jewellery only if it contained a piece of his hair meticulously braided and framed in jet or gold. When the year elapsed, you could transition into half mourning, which was essentially the Victorian version of colour rehab. You were allowed shades of grey, lavender and mauve, but in controlled patterns. The reasoning was that grief should diminish slowly, like watercolour bleeding out, never suddenly, never cheerfully. And it wasn't just the widow who observed the rules. Entire households entered mourning. Servants might be equipped in black armbands or modified uniforms. The curtains were closed. Clocks could be covered. The family's visiting calendar contracted dramatically because to host or attend social events too soon after a loss would indicate that your sorrow was superficial. If anyone believed you were moving on too rapidly, you could expect murmured disapproval over teacups across town. Even meals could be muted. Affairs during mourning, elaborate dinners were reduced, entertainment was suspended, and the entire household operated at a quieter pace. The mourning period became a sort of social isolation, where any signs of vitality were kept firmly out of public view. And here's the thing, the mourning wasn't entirely for you. It was for everyone observing you. Victorians believed grief had a proper form, and that failing to honour it didn't just reflect badly on your emotional state, it reflected badly on your character. To be negligent about mourning was to be negligent about respectability itself. There were, of course, levels of mourning depending on the relationship. Losing a spouse brought the longest and most visible constraints. A parent or child merited a similarly long period, though often slightly shorter. A more distant relative might earn you 6 months in black. An acquaintance, a subtle armband or darker dress for a few weeks would suffice. Death was not just personal, it was hierarchical. Sometimes, mourning dress functioned as social protection. A woman in deep mourning could decline invitations without offence. She could bypass awkward social calls, refuse dances, and restrict conversation without anyone accusing her of impoliteness. Grief in this sense became a barrier, though one that weighed heavily both physically and socially. Public appearances were particularly sensitive. The first time you emerged from deep mourning attire, you were monitored closely. Were you smiling too readily? Did your lavender look a little too bright? These details mattered. In a society preoccupied with appearances, mourning was both a personal burden and a public performance. And if you think this was all voluntary, it wasn't. Mourning customs were imposed by 1,000 unspoken rules. Newspapers printed etiquette guides to instruct the bereaved on exactly how long they should wear certain colours. Fashion houses sold entire lines of mourning clothing. Even stationery was printed in black borders so that your grief was declared with every letter you sent. For children, mourning was less about personal loss and more about family unity. If your household went into mourning, so did you. Whether you grasped the death or not, you wore the colours, observed the restrictions, and avoided the laughter and noise that might seem improper. And then there was the peculiar Victorian practice of post-mortem photography. Families sometimes arranged to have portraits taken of the deceased, often styled to appear as though the person were simply asleep. These photographs could then be exhibited or kept in albums as a memento. It was all part of the conviction that death should be recognised, marked and remembered in tangible form. Even visits to the grave were conducted in a certain style. Outings to cemeteries were solemn, dignified, and often executed in the same deliberate, rule-bound manner as other social activities. The graveyard wasn't just a place of mourning, it was another public space where you displayed your respectability. And yes, all of this was draining, not just emotionally, but logistically. You didn't simply wake up one morning and decide to return to colour. You eased back into it, introducing lighter shades slowly, as though testing the air for judgment. In some cases, people continued to wear traces of mourning for years. A brooch, a piece of jet jewellery, or a black ribbon as a permanent badge of loss. Because in Victorian England, mourning wasn't just about the person who died. It was about the living and how well they could demonstrate to themselves, to their peers, to the entire watching world that they were the right kind of sorrowful. And nothing said coping quite like wearing black until you forgot what sunlight looked like. If you were born into a working-class Victorian family, you learned early on that you existed in two different worlds and that surviving meant knowing precisely how to behave in both. At home, among neighbours and kin, etiquette was more about common sense than silver spoons. Respect was demonstrated by keeping your word, by offering a hand when someone fell ill, and by minding your own business when trouble came knocking. You didn't need a calling card to visit a friend down the street. You just showed up at the door, maybe with a bit of bread to share if you had it. Gossip wasn't an idle pastime. It was a neighbourhood security system, keeping track of who was out of work, who needed help, and who might not be trusted. But step outside your own street, and the rules shifted the moment you found yourself in the company of your betters. The shop owner who employed your brother, the vicar's wife, the factory manager. You borrowed manners the way some borrowed Sunday coats. Your speech mellowed your back, straightened your hands, found something respectable to do. You might not own the correct hat for the occasion, but you'd polish your boots and keep your head down, hoping your manners would compensate the difference. Children were no exception to this double life. At home, they ran errands, watched siblings, and more often than not, earned wages before they reached their teens. A working-class child might start in a factory, a workshop, or in service at a larger house, bearing the weight of adult responsibility before they'd lost all their baby teeth. At home, they were spirited, quick-witted, and often cheeky, because humour was a currency in itself. But in front of an employer, they learned to become small, quiet, and useful, because one wrong word could mean lost wages for the whole household. Meals reflected this split existence too. At home, dinner might be bread and dripping or a stew stretched thin over too many plates. You ate quickly because there was work to get back to. But if you were fortunate enough to be invited to a better-off family's table, perhaps through church connections, you'd keep your eyes on your plate and mirror the pace of the host. No reaching across the table, no talking with your mouth full, and certainly no wiping your hands on your trousers, no matter how appealing. And then there was the matter of dress. The everyday clothes of a working-class family were selected for survival, not style. Patched trousers, worn boots, aprons that could take a beating. But when Sunday rolled around, the transformation was striking. Families emerged in their best clothes that might be years out of fashion, but were clean, mended, and carefully preserved. Hats were brushed, collars were stiffened, and even the youngest child was scrubbed until their skin was pink. Sunday best wasn't just about God, it was about being seen in public as respectable, no matter how little you possessed. For working-class women, etiquette was its own balancing act. In the home and among friends, warmth and plain speaking were appreciated. In service to the middle or upper classes, deference was anticipated. You didn't start conversation, you didn't share opinions unless prompted, and you certainly didn't point out when an employer was mistaken. But the moment you were back in your own kitchen, the gloves came off, sometimes literally, and the language grew coarser. Men faced their own version of the double life in the pub, among mates. The talk was unrestricted and often loud, filled with local news and grievances about wages. But in dealings with the foreman or during a church fundraiser, a working man was expected to present a quiet, dependable front. Too much familiarity with one's betters was frowned upon. Too little could be interpreted as insolence. Children absorbed these lessons simply by watching. They knew instinctively when to laugh, when to stay silent, when to lower their gaze. The unwritten rules were transmitted not through lectures, but through the daily dance of survival. A good working-class child could navigate the world of their own back alley and in the same day stand rigid and well-mannered in front of a wealthier employer without missing a beat. It wasn't hypocrisy, it was strategy. Life in the working class was a constant negotiation between pride and pragmatism. You kept your head high in your own community because respect was earned, not given. But you also knew when to bow it. Just enough to keep the rent paid and the bread on the table. And here's the quiet truth. The double life made people adaptable in a way the upper classes rarely had to be. When you live at the mercy of someone else's wage packet, you learn to interpret a room faster than most people can read a letter. You know when a joke will warm the air or when it will close a door. You know how to conceal disappointment behind a polite nod. And you know that sometimes playing the part of the deferential worker in the morning means you can come home in the evening and be the king or queen of your own small table. The Victorians liked to believe their society was orderly and fixed. But for the working-class family, every day was a balancing act between two worlds, one built on survival and solidarity, the other on presentation and performance. And if you could handle both, you might not rise far, but you'd keep your place. And sometimes that was victory enough. Night has finally descended over the house, and the chaos of the day retreats into a softer kind of order. The gas lamps are lowered, their yellow glow shrinking into small halos that tremble against the wallpaper. In the kitchen, the last kettle hisses faintly before it's poured one final cup before bed. Upstairs, the fires are banked, the embers turned in on themselves so they'll survive until morning. Ready to be coaxed back into life, you withdraw to your place. Not just your bed, but your place in the great household order. The master and mistress close their doors. The children are tucked in, neatly arranged in their narrow beds. A single candle flickering on the nightstand. Down below, the servants slip into their quarters, exchanging quiet nods as they pass. Privacy is scarce, but you make do with the illusion of it. A curtain slides shut, a cover tugged up tight. The certainty that others are doing the same, retiring for the night. Still, there's a certain formality hanging in the darkness. The household keeps its own beat, and even at rest it demands its order. You don't call out from one floor to another, you don't let anything slam. You definitely don't wander the halls without reason, not if you want to avoid the watchful gaze of the servant on night duty. Yet there's something soothing in the quiet, as well. The road beyond falls silent, except for the distant sound of footsteps on stone as a policeman walks his route. The final trace of burning coal drifts through the darkness, settling around the edges of consciousness. Morning will return with the same expectations, the same rigid customs, the same endless attention to appearances and judgment. But right now, you can let the tension go. You've navigated another day, without slouching in view of others, without offering someone their tea with the wrong hand, without accidentally making yourself a person to be avoided. So rest easy. You've lived through another Victorian day without breaking an unspoken law, and in this place, that's the closest thing to tranquility you'll find.